The 28th of September, 1994. A roll-on, roll-off ferry, or ro-ro, as they are commonly called, departs Tallinn, Estonia, for Stockholm, Sweden. Aboard are nearly 1,000 people from 17 different countries, but mainly from Sweden and Estonia. The trip would take less than a day, and though the weather was poor, the ship has made this trip hundreds of times before. But within hours of departing Tallinn, the ship would be at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, with nearly 90% of the souls on board. An investigation was launched, and a culprit was named, but doubt still lingered. Was there more to the sinking of the MS Estonia than what meets the eyes? Was this a disaster or failed engineering? Or something more sinister? Estonia didn't start her life in Estonia, nor did she begin her life with the name Estonia. She actually started out in Germany. Now, forgive me as always. There are a lot of Scandinavian words in this script, and I am very much an American. So I'll try my best, but I may butcher a few of these names. The Finnish company Riederjäkti Bolaget, Sally, ordered the roll-on, roll-off ferry, which from here on I will refer to as a ro-ro, to fill a growing niche of ferry traffic in the Baltic. The ship was ordered to be built on the 11th of September 1979 from the Joseph L. Meyer shipbuilding yard in Papenburg, Germany, now called Meyer Werft. At the time, ro-ros were going through a rapid growth in size. The Viking Sally, as she was named, at that point would be the second largest ro-ro operating in the Baltic at the time. She was quite large at 509 feet or 155 meters in length and 79 feet or 24 meters at the beam. But with a decent deep draft of 18 feet or 5.6 meters and with a bulbous bow bulge, she was well suited to the often choppy Baltic and was even suited for lighter ice-breaking capabilities. The ship was also surprisingly tall, sporting 9 decks, 10 if you count the top of the bridge. Deck 0 being the tank deck containing the machinery spaces, engine rooms, bow thruster tunnel, etc., but also a sauna and a swimming pool. Deck 1 was for economy class cabins and the engine control room, and housed 358 passengers. These two decks features 15 watertight traverse bulkheads, as well as watertight doors and a double bottom hull. Deck 2 and 3 was the car deck. The space was largely open and sported 4 lanes of cars and trucks with a central sort of island for the stairs offset more to starboard. There were 2 stern loading ramps and 1 bow offloading ramp. There were also car lifts so that cars could be hoisted a deck higher to make room for more vehicles below them. Deck 4 contained many of the ship's passenger cabins. Also on this deck was a large conference room, a cafeteria, and a large quantity of seating for those that didn't purchase a room for the rather long 14-hour voyage. On Deck 5 and 6 were yet more passenger cabins, as well as one of the highlights of the ship, the duty-free shop, where passengers could purchase cheaper, tax-free goods. Also on this level were a few bars, some restaurants, and several entertainment areas. On the night of her sinking, several passengers were crowded in a lounge to listen and sing karaoke. Deck 7 was largely composed of crew cabins, and also was the embarkation deck for the ship's lifeboats, while Deck 8 had the davits for said boats, as well as where they were stored. The ship had 10 lifeboats in total, capable of carrying 692 people combined. She also carried 63 inflatable life rafts capable of carrying 1,575 people. This allowed room for more passengers than the Estonia could carry, 2,267 despite her only carrying 2,000 at a time. These rafts all featured hydrostatic release systems, meaning that should the ship sink, the rafts would automatically be deployed and float to the surface. On Deck 8 there were more crew cabins and the navigation bridge was on Deck 9. The ship was powered by 4 diesel engines connected in pair to 2 propellers. The engines were large, 4-stroke, turbocharged 8-cylinder engines. Each engine could maintain about 4,400 kilowatts, or about 5,900 horsepower. Which, not being an engineer, I had to look up the difference. Apparently horsepower was coined in the 18th century by Scottish engineer James Watt to help explain to his idiot non-engineer friends how strong a steam engine is compared to a draft horse. Nowadays, of course, Europeans use watts instead of horsepower, while us Americans closely cling to it. I mean, I get it. I don't care how many watts strong your ship is. Tell me how many Clydesdales it can beat in a tug-of-war. But I digress. The ship's props were controllable pitch props, or CPPs, meaning the propeller shaft wouldn't change direction for forward and reverse. Instead, the blades would change in pitch depending on the throttle setting. So the throttle would change the RPM of the shaft as well as change the pitch of the propellers. Each set of props also had a rudder behind it. In the bow, there were 2 bow thrusters, likely to help move the large bow with its underwater bulge. The ship's power was provided by 4 electric generators providing 1,650 kilovolt amps each. These were hooked up to 4-stroke trunk diesel engines that could generate 1,104 kilowatts. The system was supplemented by an E-gen on deck 8 in case the system failed. The E-gen was supposed to start automatically within 15 seconds of a power outage. This diesel generator could produce about 312 kilowatts, and powered emergency lighting and essential systems like radios, radar, public address systems, and navigation light. Ballasting was done by 2 centrifugal pumps running at 300 cubic meters or 10,594 cubic feet per hour, which is a pretty amazing 1,300 gallons per minute. Combined, that's 2,600 gallons per minute. The ballast system was split into 7 tanks: the fore-peak, forward trim, 2 double bottom tanks, 2 heeling tanks, and an aft peak tank. Fore and aft trim was controlled by the peak tanks and the forward trim tank. Port and starboard list was controlled by adding or removing water from the heeling tanks. These were large 183 cubic meters or 6,400 cubic feet tanks on either side of the keel. But the main factor affecting the list was the placement of cars on the car deck. Good distribution of the cars tended to affect list greater than ballasting. In total, the entire ballast system could hold 1,212 cubic meters of water, or 42,801 cubic feet. A part of vital importance to any ro-ro ferry, and this one in particular, is the bow loading ramp and visor. The construction of the bow ramp and visor were designed and delivered by a German company called Von Tell AB. They subcontracted the manufacturing through Grimmereds Werkstads AB. Then the shipyard itself was responsible for the installation. The rules at the time for the ro-ro door and ramp strength were sort of general and non-specific, just that they should be firmly secured and a general idea of how to do so. Also that the external parts that encountered the weather, such as the exterior of the visor, should be as strong as the hull itself. The bow visor itself was essentially a false nose for the ship. Based upon ballasting, it sat a good bit above the waterline. It was constructed of steel, essentially the same as the rest of the hull. The lower hull strakes were reinforced for ice breaking. The visor in total weighed 56 tons. When open, it raised up on hinges on the forecastle, and when closed, it had several locking mechanisms at the bottom and sides. When closed, it acted as the ship's forecastle. Also of note was the fact that the visor wasn't visible from the bridge when closed. Insurance of its closure was done by lights in the bridge that activated when the locks were enabled, as well as regular rounds by the crew. The bottom lock, called the Atlantic lock, was supposed to be automatic, and it was a locking bolt hydraulically pushed into a mating lug. It was a self-contained system that should stay locked even if hydraulic pressure was lost. The side locks were similar to the bottom lock in design. These 2 were automatic as well. There were additional side locks that were manually latched by the crew, totaling 5 locks. Recessed behind the bow visor and attached to the car deck was the bow ramp. This ramp was about 32 feet or 9.7 meters long when it's fully extended, and 20 feet or 6.2 meters wide. When in the up position, it was taller than the deck, so the bow visor had a notch in the top for the bow ramp to recess into. When closed, the bow ramp had a series of 6 locks. Closure of the ramp was indicated with a light in the bridge. The whole system was largely watertight but tended to leak a bit around the edges in rough weather. The bow also had 4 CCTV cameras to watch it, and it was the able-bodied seaman on watch's duty to occasionally check it during his watch. Once completed on the 20th of June 1980, the ship was delivered to Ridderjahti Baulejet Sally and named the Viking Sally. The ferry operated on the Turku, Finland to Stockholm, Sweden route. Ridderjahti Baulejet was a major Finnish shipping company at the time, operating both tankers and ferries. After 6 years of operation, the ship was taken over by the F-John Group, but continued on the same route operating on the Viking Line. Then in 1990, the F-John Group transferred her to the Silja Line, but kept her on the same Turku to Stockholm route. Her name was changed to the Silja Star to reflect this. Once more in 1991, she was transferred to the Wasa Line, a subsidiary of the F-John Group, and operated in the Gulf of Bothnia. She would travel between Vasa, Finland, and Umeå, or Sundsvall, Sweden. The name was once more changed to Vasa King. Again, I apologize for any mispronunciations. I think that's how you pronounce them, but again, I'm very American, so I'm sorry to any of the Scandinavian or Baltic people. In 1993, the ship was transferred to the Eastland Marine Company Limited. It was originally registered to Cyprus to satisfy a European International Financing Institution's requirements for financing vessels on a mortgage basis. She was also parallel registered to Estonia, where the Eastland Marine Company was headquartered, as well as where the Estonia would be operated from. She was registered on the 28th of January 1993 and had her name changed to MS Estonia. She was placed on the Tallinn Estonia to Stockholm Sweden line, and her first voyage on this line was the 1st of February 1993. The Estonia would perform this regularly. Every other day she'd depart Tallinn at 1900 hours local time, travel 225 nautical miles, traveling an average of 16.5 knots. In roughly 14 hours she'd arrive in Stockholm at 0900 the next morning. After taking on provisions, supplies, fuel, and passengers, she'd depart Sweden at 1730 and arrive back in Estonia the next morning at 0900. The route was like clockwork and stayed very close to schedule. A Stockholm pilot station at the Söderarm lighthouse kept a logbook of all traffic and showed the ship's passing time was the same to within about 15 minutes each day. The ship would depart on her final voyage on Tuesday, the 27th of September, 1994. Before the ship got underway, it was inspected that day for training by the Estonian Maritime Administration. The ship was found to be seaworthy, with only a few noted discrepancies. It was noted the rubber seal around the bow visor was a bit worn, and a few watertight hatch covers on the car deck were left open. The ship was loaded normally, taking on about 40 vehicles, distributed around the car deck about 1,100 tons worth. There were additionally 989 passengers and crew on board. With the distribution of vehicles favoring the starboard side, there was a slight list to starboard that was corrected by flooding the port ballast tanks, reducing the list to a negligible about 1 to 2 degrees starboard list. The ship's metacentric height was later calculated to be about a positive 3.8 feet or 1.17 meters, which was well above the minimum requirement of 2 feet or 0.63 meters. The stern trim was reported to have been around a foot and a half or 0.5 meters. At 1300 hours, the Swedish Meteorological and Hydrological Institute issued the weather forecast for the day. They placed the wind speed at 23 to 33 knots or 43 to 61 kilometers per hour, which in the United States would be classified as a small craft advisory. Around an hour later, a warning was issued stating the winds were likely to be about 33 to 38 knots, or 61 to 70 kilometers per hour, which would be classified as a gale warning. A small aside, the official report had the winds in meters per second, which I don't know if that's a European thing, but I have never heard winds reported in meters per second. It confused the heck out of me. I had to do a lot of calculations. Anyways, later on, the Navtex, or Navigational Telex, which is an automated international direct printing system, basically a service that would fax weather reports right to your ship, it reported that the wind speed would reach 38 to 47 knots or 70 to 88 kilometers per hour, well within gale force. Waves at the time were not forecasted, nor was there an instrument in usage for recording wave height in the Baltic, but reports hold that significant wave height that night was anywhere from 9 foot to 17 feet, or 3 meters to 5.4 meters. This isn't insignificant. After the incident, the investigation agency plotted the likelihood of the vessel having ever reached waves as large as 3 meters as only 11%, meaning there is an extremely high likely chance these were the worst seas the Estonia had ever seen in her career in the Baltic. So at 1915, the Estonia reversed away from her berth in Tallinn, Estonia with 989 souls on board, 803 passengers and 186 crew. Passengers were from 19 different countries and every walk of life. The Stockholm police were returning from a convention with 64 officers on board. A group of Bible school students were taking the trip as well. On board was the mayor and most of the city council for a small Estonian town called Worsen. The captain of the Estonia from the day she entered service with the Eastland Marine Company was 40-year-old Estonian Avro Andresen. He started life going to the Tallinn Marine School at only 15. He was a mariner all his life, getting his captain position in 1986 and captaining his first ro-ro in 87. There was another captain on board that day, though he was only along for the ride. 39-year-old Estonian Avo Pitt was riding to Stockholm to take a pilotage exam for his license. He had been sailing for 19 years and was up on the bridge that night getting familiar with the route. On the bridge at the time of the incident was one of the second officers on board. There were two on the Estonia, as well as a third officer. Of the on-duty bridge team, only a single able-bodied seaman survived to give his account. Typically, a trip on MS Estonia would be a rather jovial affair, purchasing cheaper booze and gifts at the duty-free shop or hitting up one of the several bars or lounges, going to the casino, or maybe hitting up the dance floor. In spite of the poor weather, there was still revelers that night. Karaoke was in full swing for much of the night, people laughing and singing along. The mood was light in many places, in stark contrast to the poor weather brewing just outside their windows. But many grew seasick or turned in early due to the rotten weather. Once the Estonia left the breakwall, her four engines were brought up to 90% power and the ship's cruising speed of 16.5 knots. The weather at the time was brisk, but not awful. The air temp was about 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius, and the water temp was pretty much the same. The winds were southerly at about 20 miles per hour or 30 kilometers per hour, not quite a small craft advisory. As the ship came to port to a 262 degrees true and hugged the Estonian coast, it was relatively sheltered from the wind. At 2000, Second Officer Peter Knusar took the watch with Third Officer Andres Tames. Once out in the open, the winds veered to the southwest, hitting MS Estonia on her port bow. The crew didn't reduce speed, though, making the ride significantly rougher for the passengers. By midnight, the winds had jumped up to 35 or 40 miles per hour, or 50 to 70 kilometers per hour. Significant wave height was 10 to 13 feet, or 3 to 4 meters. The going was rough, and many passengers went to their cabins early. By now, wind pressure on the port side caused the list to starboard to increase a degree or two. At 0025, the ship reached a waypoint of 59 degrees 20 minutes north by 22 degrees 00 minutes east. It came to starboard to a 287 degrees true following its track. With conditions worsening, the fin stabilizers below the waterline were extended to help ease the pitching and rolling. At 0100 hours, a series of events began that would culminate in the ship being on her side in just 30 minutes, and beneath the waves in under an hour. It began as the AB of the watch was conducting his round of the car deck. As he reached the bow, he heard a series of 2 resounding bangs. So great were these bangs that passengers all throughout the ship reported hearing them after the event. He immediately reported them to the bridge, which asked for him to find the source of them. Checking the ramp locks and indicator lights, he reported everything was normal. At this time, the watch was relieved by the second officer B and the fourth officer. More pounding was reported by passengers and off-duty crew at about 0105. The able seaman reached the bridge around the same time as Master, Captain Andresen, made it up to the bridge. The AB was then ordered back down to the car deck to inspect it, but he would never make it all the way down there. At this point, the engineering team down in the control room would look over and see water begin to surge into the car deck at a rapid rate from their CCTVs, but surprisingly, they didn't report this to the bridge. At around 0115, the ship began to list heavily as the bow ramp was wrenched forward. The car deck began to flood rapidly from a massive ingress of water. The ship began listing heavily to starboard, the bridge team seeming to realize something was gravely wrong as the ship finally reduced speed and slowly began to fall off to port of her track. They also ordered the closings of the watertight fittings on the lower decks. Once the list was noticed, passengers began to panic and surge towards the uppermost decks. Ironically enough, the ones that did this were the most likely to survive. Those that didn't stir quick enough were more likely to get trapped in their cabins due to the rapid listing of the ship, or get tangled in the crush of bodies that developed in each ladder well. By 0120, a woman's voice transmitted over the ship's public address system. Herre, herre, lavean herre. Estonian for alarm, alarm, there is alarm on the ship. This was the first and only indicator that there was any sort of emergency on the ship. For most of the passengers, this was their indicator to evacuate. For many that didn't speak Estonian, this only added to the growing confusion. Over the crew radios, Mr. Skylight was transmitted, an indicator to manned lifeboat stations. On the bridge, as the ship listed, the officers ordered the engineers to counterflood the port ballast tanks to balance out the ship. But due to the cargo distribution, the port tanks were already flooded to maximum capacity. On top of that, the intake for the bilge flood pump was out of the water, just sucking air. During all of this, the lamps on the bridge indicated the visor and bow ramps were still closed and never changed to indicate any different. Crew handed out life vests to the panicked passengers that could reach the top decks. This was no easy task. The ship reached a 45-degree list within minutes. The ladder wells were a tangled mess of bodies and people straining to climb the decks. Some people froze in fear and refused to move. Others couldn't cling to the rails and fell into the tangled piles of bodies and furniture, breaking limbs and ensuring their demise. Some turned back to help others onto the top decks. Others climbed single-mindedly past weaker passengers, set on saving themselves. The elderly and young had little hope of surviving. Of the few that would survive, only 7 of them were over the age of 55. Not a single child under the age of 12 survived. At 0122, the first distress call was sent out over the radio, and only heard by a few local ferries. It's believed it was sent on a short-range radio. 2 minutes later, another mayday was sent out with a more powerful radio, this one picked up by shore stations. But shortly after this, the list had reached 40 degrees. The ship's main engines were starved of oil and fuel and gave out, followed very shortly by the generators. The ship was thrown into darkness momentarily. It was only illuminated again as the emergency generators flipped on for a short time before they too failed. The engineers were forced to flee the engine room via the ship's smokestack. They remembered climbing almost parallel to the sea, burning their hands as they climbed for their lives. By now the ship lost all headway and was broadside to the seas. As the ship laid on her side, water filled in from the bow and now the stern ramps. It was impossible to launch any lifeboats due to the list. As life vests were handed out, life rafts were inflated and moved to the side. Many simply chose to leap into the sea with or without life vests. But in the 50-degree Fahrenheit or 10-degree Celsius water, life expectancy wasn't high, with or without a life vest. By 0130, the ship was fully on her side, her starboard side entirely submerged. Life rafts were launched and a lifeboat broke free but was fully upside down, the passengers on her underside unable to right her. Hundreds watched, stunned, as the ship rolled over and went down by the stern, leaving them cold and shocked, bobbing in the stormy Baltic. The ship disappeared off radar of nearby ships at around 0150. Its position was 59 degrees, 22 minutes, 9 seconds north by 21 degrees, 41 minutes, 0 seconds east. For around 750 souls on board, they would sink 80 meters to the seafloor and were never to be seen again. The captain, Avro Andresen, as well as all the bridge team, were lost with the ship. Some people reported seeing Avo Pitt, the captain, riding to Stockholm. Some even said he was rescued, but if he was, he couldn't be found after. Some speculated he went into hiding for some reason. More likely, survivors were mistaken and he perished with the rest. But those off the ship weren't out of danger yet. Life rafts bobbed to the surface, their hydrostatic releases cutting them free from the hull, automatically inflating them. But many inflated upside down or were quickly buffeted away by the winds and seas. One man was in a life raft that overturned, trapping him underneath. He listened in shock as others climbed onto the overturned raft above him and huddled in the bottom of it. All he could do was bang and yell on the bottom. The others reassured him and kept him calm throughout the night. MS Estonia was fitted with 2 EPIRBs, or Emergency Position Indicating Radio Beacons. These are fantastic tools and can pinpoint a sinking ship's position to within a nautical mile. They automatically send out a signal to any number of land-based monitoring stations that initiate the SAR program for the area. They're an amazing tool that was rendered useless because they were never activated. The untrained passengers hadn't the slightest idea how to survive in the rafts. Some panicked and fired all of the raft's flares in quick succession, or they simply didn't know how to flip the life rafts over. Many didn't know the rafts came with survival gear in them, or didn't know the flaps on them could be closed to provide additional protection from the elements. The weight in the rafts was mental anguish. Waves poured cold water into the rafts, and the passengers shivered in hip-deep water. Several in the night lost the fight and passed away, ghoulishly floating next to the surviving passengers with pale faces. Mats Finnegar, a 12-year-old from Norway, was the youngest survivor. He huddled with the other survivors that comforted him and made sure he stayed awake. He had no way of knowing his father and younger sister were still on the ship and would remain there. Despite the Mayday call being sent out, local ferries didn't arrive on scene until almost an hour after the Estonia went down. Helicopters sent from neighboring countries were sent out, organized by Maritime Rescue Coordination Center, Turku. The first helo didn't arrive on scene until 3:05, nearly an hour and a half after the sinking. They were hampered by weather and a general misunderstanding of the severity of the event. Ferries arriving struggled with life-saving efforts. The bad weather made launching rescue craft nearly impossible. Many survivors were too weak to climb scramble nets or onto the decks of ferries. Some ferries used their own life rafts on cranes to pick up survivors. The incident wasn't appropriately classified as a major incident until 0230. On duty at MRCC Turku and MRCC Helsinki, there were only one person each. While MRCC Turku set a helicopter crew on standby at 0126 and another at 0135, MRCC Helsinki transmitted a pon-pon radio call, or an urgent marine broadcast, instead of a mayday. MRCC Tallinn didn't hear of the incident until almost 3 in the morning. The master of the ferry, Silja Europa, declared himself the on-scene commander and began organizing rescue efforts with the 4 ferries in the area. At 0650, an air rescue coordinator landed on the Silja Europa, and at 0945, a surface rescue coordinator landed. But rescue efforts were slow. A few aircraft had only single crew members attempting to rescue and care for survivors. 3 of the Swedish Navy helicopters had winch issues. Some helicopters arrived with journalists on board, restricting how many survivors they could take on board to make room for a journalist. Of the some 300 people that made it off the ship, only about 140 of them were rescued. A few later perished on land. Only 137 of the 989 souls on board survived. An investigation was being formed before the rescue was even complete. A joint nation investigative board was conceived. The JAIC, or Joint Accident Investigation Commission, was a group of 35 experts from Finland, Sweden, and Estonia that would piece together the puzzle that was the mysterious and rapid sinking of the Estonia, the worst maritime disaster to strike the Baltic countries since the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff in 1945. The investigators started with conducting dozens of interviews, even as rescuers were still combing the Baltic. The wreck was quickly found on the 30th of September using echo-sounding technology. Initially hampered by weather, the wreck was marked so it could be inspected by ROVs later. The ROVs found the ship 120 degrees on her starboard bow, sitting in thick clay about 240 to 278 feet, or 74 to 85 meters deep on an underwater slope. It was surrounded by a large debris field, but one thing was quickly clear: the bow visor was nowhere around it. They set out to find it a day later, searching with side-scan sonar. The visor was found about a nautical mile to the west. It was obvious it had fallen off much prior to sinking. Several dives and ROV investigations were conducted, along with interviews, looks into past inspections, and looks into the construction of the vessel. After years, the commission released its final conclusion. This final report can be found online, and I highly suggest reading into it for yourself if you're interested. I'll post a link below. The determination was that the heavy seas battered the bow visor repeatedly. The visors, at the time, had rather loose specifications set for it. The Bureau Veritas, the governing body set for inspecting the MS Estonia, had no specific specifications for the strength of the bow visors. So the bow visor was battered loose, the banging sound the AB heard. Finally, it fell loose, dragging open the bow ramp. The visor fell off and the ramp lay open, allowing water to flow onto the car deck and down into the lower compartments. Under SOLAS regulations, or safety of life at sea, ships require a forward collision bulkhead if they operate further than 20 nautical miles at sea. Initially, the Estonia, before she was the Estonia, never traveled this far. But when she transferred to Eastland Marine, she did start traveling that far, but the necessary changes were never made. I got a chance to speak with Jörgen Zachow, the investigator in charge of the Statens Havari Commission, the Swedish Accident Investigation Authority. First off, he was extremely helpful along with the entire office. I'm sure he didn't expect some strange Great Lakes sailing YouTuber to call him and fail incredibly at saying, "Hello, how are you?" in very bad Swedish. Thank God he spoke amazing English, or it would have been a very short interview. That said, he commented on the Estonia not meeting the collision bulkhead SOLAS regulation, stating he soundly believed this fell on the enforcement agency for not enforcing this law. This alone could have likely saved Estonia. But with the visor off and ramp down, water flooded the car deck and lower decks. Once the ship began listing, alarms weren't raised fast enough or efficiently enough. There was no way everyone would have survived Estonia's sinking. It's likely that even under perfect conditions, maybe only half could have been saved. Once the listing had reached a certain point, windows broke and open doors on upper decks allowed progressive flooding. Once on her side, it was all over. Delayed and inefficient responses from rescuing bodies only added to the already massive death toll. So there it was, the report was out, the findings posted. The visor was found to be not constructed to the tolerance needed, the crew didn't travel at a safe speed, they didn't raise alarms fast enough, rescuers made a general poor showing. Cut and dry case. But not long after, suspicions arose and doubt was raised. A private investigation was soon raised, not by any of the involved nations, but by a German group. This group simply went by the German Group of Experts. They conducted their own investigation and published wildly different findings, stating such things as the bow visor not being secure before leaving the breakwall and having to be tied down, the ship taking on a massive lift sooner than reported, and distress calls prior to the recorded one at 0122, and that the bow visor didn't come off until the ship was fully on her side. They stated the ship sank far too rapidly and that there had to have been a hole in the side, even going so far as to say that explosives might have been planted on the side of the ship. These findings were wildly different and cast doubt on the official report. It went so far as to inspire journalist Drew Wilson to write a book called The Hull, in which he discusses the numerous possible scenarios in which the MS Estonia couldn't have sank but could have been sunk. He states such possibilities as accidentally being hit by a recently purchased Soviet submarine, escaping during a storm to whatever country purchased it, to the ship being bombed by anti-Estonian terrorist organization, to even a plot to kill Swedish police by former Soviet smugglers. Now, usually I ignore conspiracy theorists, but this time I fully understand why they've popped up. It was fully to do with the political handling of the ship after the disaster. Sweden taking a heavy role in the investigation and rescue. At the time, Sweden's Prime Minister Carl Bildt expressed his intention to recover the bodies from the Estonia. The incoming Prime Minister Ingvar Carlsson mirrored these sentiments, showing his desire to bring closure to the situation. The families of the deceased were elated, but as the investigation progressed, it became more and more obvious how daunting of a task that would be. There were over 700 people in the wreck, trapped in cabins and stuck in a mostly overturned wreck. The wreck was in a relatively shallow water, but was in bad shape after hitting the bottom. The Estonia wasn't an easy dive. The inside was a tangled honeycomb of cabins and ladder wells. Pulling bodies out one by one would be exhausting and extensive, as well as mentally taxing. Refloating it was likewise extremely expensive and difficult. Ultimately, it was decided that the site would instead be named a burial site. A not unheard of idea. There's been plenty of times before that this was done, but what was baffling was the next plan. The site was shallow, just 200 some feet or 80 meters, within diving distance. To prevent grave robbers, the government made it illegal to dive the site, which again, that was reasonable. But on top of that, they suggested covering the wreck in concrete, like a concrete sarcophagus, which has never been done before. The suggestion was odd, impractical, and to many, rather suspicious. The idea was attempted but ultimately failed. The concrete sunk into the clay, there were underwater landslides, it was a mess, and ultimately it was abandoned because it was impractical. But the idea sowed the seeds of doubt. It wasn't seen as a way to stop grave robbers, but the government trying to hide something. People don't like being told they can't know something. It breeds skepticism, and skepticism breeds conspiracy. Even though the commission completed their investigation and posted their findings, people weren't happy. They couldn't see their loved ones, and the government tried burying them under concrete. Why? What happened to the ship? Something awful had to have happened, and they didn't want them to know. The conspiracy of the whole grew and spiraled out of control. I spoke briefly to Drew Wilson before he stopped answering my emails. Reading his book, it seems to very closely mirror the German group of experts. So why should scrutiny be thrown towards the German report? Well, because it was funded by the company that built the ship, the ones ultimately blamed for the accident with their faulty visor. It would be believed that the company that is being blamed might show a bit of bias in their investigation. Just a thought. Drew stands fervently on the fact that a hole had to have been put inside. And what do you know? In 2020, a German ROV film team snuck over the wreck site and sent an ROV down and filmed a large 20-meter long hole in the side of the ship. Aha! There you go. That's the smoking gun. They were right. The investigation had to be reopened, just to find that the hole was actually more of an indentation in the side with some metal fracturing. The culprit, a large, nice stone ridge on the bottom, right beneath the wreck, exactly the size of the indentation. The wreck landed on it when it sank, and the hole was even largely above the waterline. This wasn't the hole they were looking for. Drew Wilson states that the ship couldn't have sank that fast, not taking into account the investigators that day found watertight fittings on the car deck that were left open. The watertight doors were ordered to be closed, but were never confirmed to be so. On top of that, the ventilation for the lower decks were piped in from the car deck, meaning huge ventilation shafts could have easily allowed water into the lower accesses of the ship. The ship could have easily sank in such time. He eagerly points out that the Wilhelm Gustloff sank in twice as much time after being torpedoed 3 times in her side, but never looks into the nuances of them being 2 completely different ships with different crew and different conditions. On top of all of this, numerous incidents were documented in the 20 years prior to the sinking. Ro-ro ferries with bow visor failures on systems similar to the Estonia's, ships losing their visors or having them wrenched loose by wave actions. One ship, the Jan Huvelius, even capsized in a similar way after her visor failed in January of 1993. A ship similarly designed to Estonia had her visor inspected after this and found a locking device shorn off and another badly bent. There was a precedence for these failures. They still happen plenty of times. Is the JIC report right? Is the German group of experts correct? Is Mr. Wilson correct in his theories? I don't know. I asked Mr. Zachow what he'd want people to take away from my video, and he told me, I don't want to tell people their opinions or what to believe. They can do that. But we are now 30 years after the sinking, and I still hear on the news that it's the 10-year anniversary, the 20-year anniversary, and so on, and still there are no answers. Yes, there are. Stop saying this. Jürgen is correct. The answers are out there, plain as day. On the websites below, there are all the reports. There's a full 3D scan of the hull. Drew Wilson's book is called The Hull and is available on Amazon. Many other books exist on the topic. Take a look for yourself. Come up with your own conclusions. If you'd like, tell me in the comments what you think happened in the Baltic 30 years ago. Until then, fair winds and following seas, shipmates. So, this was a long time coming. I know I've been gone for almost a year now. I'm sorry for that, but life at sea doesn't really leave much room for YouTube content. In fact, I'm rushing to finish this video before getting back on the ship for another hitch. It'll be a bit before my next video, but I assure you, not as long as it was. I want to thank the patrons for sticking it out through this long hiatus. You guys are incredible. As always, check out the links to my merch and check out my socials, and join the Discord if you want. We have a good time on there. It's pretty entertaining. I appreciate all the support and hope to bring you more information very soon. Until then, fair winds and following seas, shipmates.